Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Scotland at 7. It is the 18th of February, and joining me on the programme this evening, we have a regular contributor who's sadly not been terribly well recently, but welcome back to the programme to Daye Tucker.
Thank you very much. Nice to be back.
I'm glad to see you back to almost full health, Daye. And also joining us this evening is Councillor Audrey Nicol from Aberdeen. Welcome to the programme, Audrey.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Right, well, I'm going to press on with the coronavirus update first of all before we come to the main points of tonight's news. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 1,641,860 people in Scotland have now been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 1,446,906 were confirmed negative. 194,954 have tested positive. There are 685 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. Now, this will be an underestimate of the number of cases because not everyone with the virus displays symptoms, and not all those with the symptoms will be tested. There were 57 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who've died from complications caused by the coronavirus COVID-19 infection now stands at 6,885. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,261 were in hospital last night, 95 of whom were in intensive care. Now, as of 8 a.m. this morning, 1,354,966 people have now received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 24,169 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures published today show that 119,387 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 454 since yesterday. This number refers to all deaths in all settings and not just in hospitals. If you'd like to join us in the conversation here this evening, you can, of course, do so on Twitter by following us at Broadcast Scot and using the hashtag Scotland@7. Now to tonight's main headlines. Scottish hauliers and manufacturers launch a scathing attack on the Brexit deal. Boris Johnson's hard Tory Brexit deal has been on the end of a scathing attack at a Hollywood committee by leading Scottish hauliers and manufacturers. The Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee heard from Martin Reid from the Road Haulage Association and from Paul Sheeran of Scottish Engineering. Mr Sheeran told the committee that the end of the transition period could not have come at a worse time. He also reported from a survey of members that found 3/4 of manufacturing businesses have experienced some form of adverse impact since Scotland was dragged out of the EU. Businesses have told of higher costs in administration and a lack of availability of materials, with one firm reporting a 10-fold increase in admin costs as a result of Brexit and having goods held up for 3 weeks at the border. Mr Reid told how he felt that nobody will have had any benefit from Brexit in terms of moving goods to Europe. He also reported how businesses with exporting in their DNA are struggling. Mr Reid read out findings from members of the Road Haulage Association that lack of preparation by the UK government has led to many exporters having to relearn the basics of moving goods. Let me come to Daye Tucker first of all. Daye, I know you haven't been active in the programme for a little while, but figures coming from the Road Haulage Association and now also from the engineering manufacturers are really a cause for concern, aren't they?
Absolutely. And one wonders, where have they been for the last 4 or 5 years? You know, it was always on the cards. Did they not understand what this would mean? I just find it extraordinary that people are so behind the curve and appear to be surprised at what is actually happening now.
Could it be, Daye, the fact that most of the people now running companies like manufacturing and haulage companies actually weren't alive at the time before we joined the European Union, don't actually remember how to do all the paperwork anymore?
No, I wouldn't say that, because there's still plenty of paperwork that they've been doing. You know, whether you blame the EU for lots of paperwork or our own government. And certainly, as far as I'm aware as a farmer, the EU would set out the guidelines and the kind of vague rules to follow. The
Yeah.
UK would then gold plate them, and then Scottish Government would gold plate the rules that came down from Westminster or DEFRA. So, no, I don't think it's that. I think they've always had paperwork to deal with, but the paperwork that they're having to deal with now is just extraordinary and very badly managed by the UK government.
Okay, thank you, Daye. Turning to you, Councillor Nicol, Audrey Nicol. Now, just talking today there, she was saying that she felt that the businesses had 4 years to get ready for this. Do you think there has been a kind of waiting where businesses have been waiting for guidance from the UK government and that guidance just simply hasn't materialised?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what's happened. And I think the disappointing thing is that that continued despite repeated calls from businesses, from representative organisations, from the Scottish Government to provide that information so that we were really ready to go, or as prepared as we could be when we moved towards Brexit. So that's really disappointing. I think for me, what I'm particularly concerned about is the impact on small businesses, where the sort of proportionate impact is much greater. So that makes it all the more frustrating that livelihoods for family businesses, for example, have been so badly disrupted, and it was completely avoidable.
Audrey, do you think perhaps also the fact that in recent years there's been a move away in Scotland, particularly from large employers, big manufacturing businesses, to much smaller units, often, as you say, family businesses, and they lack the experience of dealing with large quantities of paperwork and bureaucracy? Do you think that could be something to do with it, that there's been a demographic change in the type of companies operating in Scotland?
But that's possibly. I mean, certainly in the northeast, we've got a mix of small, medium, and large businesses, and obviously over the years we've had the oil and gas industry operating in the area, and that comprises some very, very big businesses. I take the point that you're making, but I think it's important that we still go back to the kind of argument that this was avoidable, and perhaps recognising that there was perhaps a little, there was some inexperience in dealing with administration, with process, with bureaucracy, if you like, then that perhaps made it all the more important that the UK government did make sure that businesses were prepared.
I noticed in other news today, they're talking about there being a lack of customs agents and people in business not used to having to hire such agents in order to help them complete their paperwork. Do you know, Audrey, if there is a difficulty in getting hold of people who trained in this particular part of the bureaucracy?
I mean, I'm aware that this has been, this has been topical today, and that there's been some representation specifically by the Scottish Government around this very issue of sort of customs support for businesses. Again, I think it's really difficult. While we recognise that there's a need for personnel, for support, specialist support for businesses. It takes time to put that in place, and without sounding like a broken record, we knew that this was coming. The government knew that it was coming, and failed to put a plan in place to support businesses, in particular around this key issue of customs regulation and requirements.
Okay. Well, listen, we're going to move on from this story to something which is related to this.
Gordon?
Hello, yes, Daye?
Gordon?
Yes,
Just
Daye.
quickly before you move on, it's important to remember that the UK government refused the offer of a transition issues being explored and ironed out.
Yes, that's a very good point, Daye, and I take your point. I'm glad you made that there. It's very important to remember that. Now, Brexit help is needed for Scottish businesses. The Economy Secretary, Fiona Hislop, is calling on the UK government to provide further support to companies struggling to trade with the EU in post-Brexit Britain. Urgent financial assistance is needed to help small businesses to hire customs agents to deal with the additional bureaucracy involved in importing from and exporting to the European Union, with Ms Hislop suggesting that this could be provided in the form of tax credits, vouchers or grants. The proposal is amongst several made in a letter to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Michael Gove, in response to the growing impact of Brexit and his public commitment to help businesses to adjust to the new trade rules. Ms Hislop also urges the UK government to engage with the European Commission to simplify the VAT regulations on cross-border trade and to streamline arrangements for businesses moving goods to and from the EU. So, Daye, here we are coming right back to what we were talking about earlier on, the idea that the Scottish government has seen that there is a need for customs officials, customs agents to be provided, and they appear to be talking about doing something about it.
Yes, yes. Again, and the news that perhaps Michael Gove is being replaced by Lord Frost is not good either. Not that I'm a fan of Michael Gove in any way whatsoever, but there's still this interplay of jostling for power within the UK government. It's difficult to know who to go to try and get things sorted out. Who has the power?
Sorry, forgive me, Daye. Lord Frost was one of the men who helped negotiate the final deal, was he not?
Yeah, absolutely. But there's gossip that Michael Gove's position, which is quite close to the UK, to the helping people to sort Brexit out and cope with it. He's being jostled out now by this other guy, Lord Frost.
Well,
and he's not even an elected person.
No, he's just being reshuffled out of the way.
Yes.
Yeah, Audrey, what do you think about this? Lord Frost, do you think this is a good appointment? What effect will Mr. Frost have, do you think, on the various issues that we've just been talking about?
Well, I mean, I think we can only but hope that he does a better job than his predecessor, quite honestly. He's got a tall order in front of him. And I think, you mentioned the point that he's not a member of Parliament. So I think that perhaps indicates that there may be some rationale behind his appointment that we're not aware of. So I think, let's just see where it goes and what he delivers. It can't be much worse than what's been delivered so far.
Well, let's hope not. Anyway, we're going to move on now to, in fact, back to Europe, in fact. And Amsterdam is stealing a march on its rivals as wanting to be the major post-Brexit trading hub. All the talk was of Frankfurt or Paris, luring London's financial business as the UK peeled away from the EU. And yet it is Amsterdam which is proving the most visible early winner. Data last week showed the Dutch capital also displaced London as Europe's biggest share trading centre in January, grabbing a fifth of the 40 billion euros a day action, up from below a tenth of the trading pre-Brexit. And yet it's just one of several areas the city has quietly stolen a march on from its rivals as it attracts businesses from Britain, evoking memories of its history as a global trading powerhouse in the 17th century. Amsterdam has also overtaken London to become Europe's #1 corporate listing venue so far this year, the data shows. And the leader of euro-denominated interest rate swaps, a market estimated to be worth about $135 trillion in 2020. The Netherlands Foreign Investment Agency, which has led the effort to woo Brexit business, has said that it estimates that about 1,000 new jobs have been created by financial firms moving their operations to Amsterdam since the UK left the EU. That's a fraction of the 7,500 to 10,000 jobs estimated to have left London for the EU since 2016. Daye, here's an interesting story. Everybody was expecting, Paris or Berlin or somewhere else to become the major hub, and yet it's Amsterdam which seems to be taking the lead in the early moves. Why Amsterdam, do you think? Why are they so good at this, and how have they sneaked in so quickly, do you think?
I don't think they've sneaked in. I think they've always been there, because I think from memory, the potato market is largely placed in Amsterdam, and it's
Yeah,
quite a rival to the potatoes that we export in Scotland. So they've always been a big trading post, just
yeah.
working away quietly in the background. And I know several of my relatives have moved from London to Amsterdam with the Medicines Aid and various other things. My near neighbours, in fact, she is the director of the Museum of Amsterdam. So she was always travelling backwards and forwards. And it's pretty close to
Yeah.
Scotland, Amsterdam.
It is, and it's always had close links with Scotland. Of course, the flower market and the plant market is very heavily
Yes.
centred in Amsterdam as well, isn't it, Dave? But I'm just
Yeah.
thinking more about financial matters, and it's well known, of course, that Amsterdam is a world capital for diamond and gold trading. But now it seems to be getting into the business of financial transactions as well. Audrey, are you surprised by this news? It seems to have caught the media by surprise today.
Uh, but I'm not surprised. I think we could really see this coming down the track. I mean, we always knew that the financial sector would would have to fall in line with the EU regulation and legislation, and really. Throughout the sort of withdrawal agreement, there was very little provision, if any provision, made for the financial sector by the Tory government. So I think no, I'm not surprised at this at all. And there was a lot of coverage of the potential for financial centres to reduce in London and to remain within Europe. And perhaps this is the beginning of a trend that we may continue to see.
One of the
Mm.
other interesting things I noted in a programme last week, Audrey, was the fact that Scotland now has, I think it's three new stock exchanges starting up in its major cities. Has the Scottish financial sector also seen an opportunity, do you think, here for trading to be picked up in Scotland, having been lost perhaps from London?
I would very much hope so, and I think that that's the right thing to do. That's a really key part of our economy going forward, and also moving into an independent Scotland. So I think maybe the with the transition, with the changes that Brexit has brought, that this is probably a really good time for us to really start to focus on the opportunities that Brexit has created, and also the sort of body of skills of skilled workforce, of knowledge, and our history around finance that brings.
Okay, so
Yes.
maybe there is a future in sort of post-independence Scotland for an expanding financial market.
I would very much hope so. I mean, we've got a history of us having a financial centre in Scotland, largely based in Edinburgh. So I think this is a really good time for us to really develop that and make that a really key part of our economy going forward.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that,
Yes.
Audrey. I'd just like to move on to our next story now, if I would, and that is it has emerged today that 1 in 4 UK firms are planning to fire staff if the furlough ends soon. A quarter of UK businesses expect to fire staff if the Chancellor Rishi Sunak does not extend the job furlough programme that is due to expire at the end of April, the British Chambers of Commerce have said today. The Chancellor is due to deliver his annual budget speech on March the 3rd and has promised to provide more support for jobs hit by the coronavirus pandemic. But he's also seeking to reduce the deficit, despite many economists recommending continued borrowing to invest in growth while interest rates are so low. The whole of the UK has been in lockdown since the end of last year, with schools and non-essential workplaces closed and employees working from home. The official data released on Thursday showed that 20% of private sector employees were currently furloughed as of February the 11th, up from 18% 2 weeks earlier, although it's below the 30% who were on leave during the first lockdown. The furlough programme has cost £46 billion up to mid-December, the government's most expensive single economic support measure. While the new coronavirus infections have fallen by more than 3/4 since a peak at the turn of the year, the government remains concerned about the risk posed by new variants of the disease and has not yet eased lockdown rules. The BBC said that 61% of firms had suffered a fall in sales since October, based on a survey of 1,115 of its members carried out between January the 18th and January the 31st, and on ONS data, which shows spending on credit and debit cards is about 28% lower than a year ago. Cash flow was a major worry for businesses, the BBC said, with just under a quarter of businesses saying that they only had enough money to keep operating for a further 3 months. It's vital that the UK government keeps financial support going until firms can reopen and rebuild, BCC Director General Adam Marshall said. Pulling the plug now would be a huge mistake and would be akin to writing off the billions already spent in helping firms to survive. Daye, let me come to you first of all. Much is being made, there's been a lot of speculation, hasn't there, over when the Prime Minister will end the lockdown, but this business of the furlough, it always seems to remain a mystery, and it seems for some reason that Mr. Sunak has to be pushed and pushed and pushed, and he kind of teases us right up to the last minute, doesn't he, before he reveals what he's going to do. But surely this is a massive risk for the British economy as a whole and the Scottish economy in particular.
Well, yes, it is, because people find it very difficult to plan ahead. I have to say, I'm heartened by what actually the resilience that is being shown. I don't know what's going on down in England, but up here, we have businesses like not just self-employed, but semi-self-employed who work for bigger companies, but do it under the umbrella of a bigger company. People like electricians and joiners, plumbers, who are working more than they ever did before because big companies are closed down because people are working at home. And these companies are using this time to renovate and restore and repair their buildings and bring them up to date with the new demands that there's going to be in terms of using Wi-Fi and computers and distance communication, etc., etc. So it's not all gloom and doom. And yes, of course it's gloomy for those who are going to lose their jobs. But Sunak does seem to be able to pull the rabbit out the hat every now and then. So he's just proving that there actually is a magic money tree when it comes to the bit.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Audrey, we talked there about Rishi Sunak being a bit slow to react sometimes and having to be pushed to this, but Daye is giving us an upside to this. Have there been any other local upsides, do you think, to the situation that small businesses find themselves in at the moment? Have you seen anything similar in your area?
Oh, very, very much so. I mean, my ward is a really mixed area that has a range of small and medium businesses, and if it hadn't been for the furlough scheme, some of those, perhaps many of them, just wouldn't survive. So yeah, there is a huge upside to the furlough scheme, which is why it's all the more important that it continues, not just in the short term, but in the long term too, as we start to come out of lockdown. I think that the unnecessary. So I would like to see a little bit more sort of commitment to the scheme, which nobody denies is absolutely invaluable.
Thank you, Audrey. Okay. Well, let's move on now. And the Scottish COVID-19 education catch-up spend is the highest in the UK. A new report has found that Scotland has invested more money into education catch-up for pupils affected by the COVID-19 pandemic than any other part of the UK. The study from the Education Policy Institute revealed that the total amount of funding for catch-up is the largest in Scotland, £200 per pupil, compared to England at £174 per pupil, Wales at £88 per pupil, and Northern Ireland at £82 per pupil. The report also drew attention to the SNP government's support for children eligible for free school meals during the school holiday periods and the one-off payment of £100 per child in December, saying that holiday support appears to be most generous per child per day in Scotland until the Easter period. So, first of all, let me come to you, Councillor Nicol, on this one. This is another good news story, isn't it? The Scottish Government has done something and been recognised for doing it.
Absolutely, and it's come at a really important times. You mentioned there the fact that we've already committed to free school meals, and there's been the £100 per child payment in December. So I think the good thing is that what this shows is that the support that is available is being used right at the point of need. And then, of course, on top of that, this comes on the back of other sort of broader projects around supporting the expansion of early learning and childcare, closing the attainment gaps of longer term plan, PEF funding in schools. So I think this really shows a great commitment to children, but at a really key time and at the point of need.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. Dave, what was your reaction to this? This is a good story, isn't it? I mean, because the children are the future of the country, basically, aren't they? And investing in their education at the point where they really need the help surely has got to be the best thing to do.
Absolutely. And not only that, giving them food as well. What better way of investing in your future than feeding the youngsters in a healthy way and filling their brains in a healthy way as well. So yes, it's a wonderful thing, and I'm not surprised.
Are you surprised, Daye, that in this century, in the 21st century, that the Scottish Government is actually having to take steps to make sure that children are fed?
Yes and no, because we all know what has happened, and I suppose I should say, no, I'm not surprised because of what has happened and the way things have gone. And I've had enormous arguments I can remember arguing with a Labour councillor who was against giving children free school breakfasts. And his argument was that they shouldn't be given to everybody in a universal way. And I was thinking, well, hang on a minute, that you're only coming at it from one aspect. You're not looking at value of ensuring that all these youngsters are getting a healthy feed. Just because they've got wealthy parents doesn't mean that those wealthy parents are feeding them in a healthy manner.
And also, I guess children who've already had breakfast wouldn't take them anyway, would they?
That's true.
Anyway, let's leave the issue of breakfast and schools for the moment. And we're moving to the United Nations now. And the UN Secretary General has warned that human destruction of nature is senseless and suicidal. Humanity is waging a senseless and suicidal war on nature that is causing human suffering and enormous economic losses while accelerating the destruction of life on Earth, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said. Guterres' starkest warning to date came at the launch of a UN report setting out the triple emergency the world is in: the climate crisis, the devastation of wildlife and nature, and the pollution which causes so many millions of early deaths every year. Making peace with nature was a defining task of the coming decades, he said, and the key to a prosperous and sustainable future for all people. The report combines recent major UN assessments with the latest research and the solutions available, representing an authoritative scientific blueprint of how to repair the planet. The report says that societies and economies must be transformed by policies such as replacing GDP as an economic measure with one that reflects the true value of nature, as recommended this month by a study commissioned by the UK Treasury. Carbon emissions need to be taxed, and trillions of dollars of perverse subsidies for fossil fuels and destructive farming must be diverted to green energy and food production, the report says. As well as systematic changes, people in rich nations can act too, it says, by cutting meat consumption and wasting less energy and water. I think I'll go to Audrey first on this one. Audrey, we are overwhelmed with stories of COVID at the moment, but as you know, we are in the middle of a climate crisis at the moment. And the United Nations particularly seems to be taking a leading role here. How important is the environment, do you think, in the future of Scotland? Because we hear a lot about a new green sort of reindustrialisation of Scotland. But how important do you think it is for us to follow that policy now?
It's crucial. It's absolutely crucial, and I think the good thing is that we've really started not just to recognise that, but we're certainly on the road and on our journey towards making that a reality. I think for me, this is a topic that I am really interested in. I taught for 5 years in a university, and one of the areas that I was particularly interested was in global health challenges and the issues that we face around climate change and that sort of encroachment of human beings into areas where we haven't been before. That runs a real risk where we're coming face to face with species, for example, that we haven't encountered before. That runs a real risk from a health context, not just an environmental and an economic one. So the Scotland embracing environmental, the environmental agenda, climate change, and so on, is absolutely crucial. But then there's a global context to that as well. And so this is a really broad global agenda, important agenda item.
Okay, thank you very much, Audrey. Daye, with Glasgow set to host the COP26 climate change conference in Glasgow towards the end of this year, do you feel that Scotland is in a position to sort of set the pace for that? Have we done enough, or do we look green enough, do you think, when we're holding this kind of event?
Well, I think it depends who you're listening to. Probably the majority would say, yes, we're well on the road, but you'll get the two extremes, the ones who don't want to move and don't want to see the problem, and the others who want to go to the furthest extreme and turn the majority of the country into a completely rewilded state with reintroducing species, which terrifies the life out of a lot of people. Particularly farmers. Somewhere in the middle is probably the right way to go. But to get back to climate change, I must tell you that way back in the early 60s, the head of geography at Balfron High School taught his pupils about the importance of the rainforest in the Amazon.
Interesting.
And he said, if that forest ever gets destroyed, we will see endless rain in Scotland. Now, that's all those years ago, and he has been proven right.
So you feel that we are reaping the whirlwind now, Daye, in terms of what
Very
this
much
man had predicted?
Very much so. And
sorry, Daye, I missed that last
came
comment.
up with important thing that the UN, whoever's in charge of the UN, has stated is that we need to replace the measures for GDP. Now, again, going back to 2006, when I started the Rural Leadership Programme, we had two people from Scottish Enterprise who were about to disappear off into far-flung areas of the world to look at how GDP was analysed and used as data in other countries. And they, at that time, told us that in future, GDP would be measured not by financial wealth, but by things like happiness and health. And I think that's what the UN is looking for. And I know Nicola Sturgeon has been talking about that a lot herself.
Uh-huh. Well, let's hope that it comes to pass. We're going to stay with the environment for our next story. The White House is revoking a Trump order limiting climate change in federal reviews. The Biden administration today revoked a Trump administration policy that aimed to prevent federal agencies from weighing climate change impacts in their decision-making around major projects like pipelines and highways. The White House Council for Environmental Quality revoked Trump's administration's 2019 draft National Environmental Policy Act, the guidance for greenhouse gas emissions, which had rolled back an Obama-era policy here, which required agencies to evaluate climate change impacts of major infrastructure projects in their reviews. Today's action will help federal agencies to put their decisions on firmer legal and scientific footing, said Jomar Maldonado, an associate director at the council, the agency which oversees the implementation of the NEPA across the government. The Trump administration had said that limiting the consideration of climate impacts by agencies would result in faster and more efficient environmental reviews of energy and other projects required under the bedrock of NEPA law. But under the Biden administration, the council is expected to prioritise the impacts of climate change and weigh the burdens of projects on disadvantaged communities. Brenda Mallory, who has been nominated to head the council, has said that her focus would be undoing some of the changes made by Trump and how the NEPA is here and to strengthen the use of the law to better protect the environment and the communities overburdened by air and water pollution. Councillor Nicol, let me let you have a go at answering this question. Donald Trump was not really a friend of nature, was he? He was a climate denier. Are you heartened to hear that the Biden administration is reversing many of his policies?
Absolutely. I'm delighted to hear this. I'm not surprised because I think everybody recognised that Trump's climate denial approach was harmful, not just to the United States, but in a global context. You know, we would all ultimately feel the fallout from his decision making. So I'm absolutely delighted that this has happened, and I really, it's not going to happen overnight, but it's a starting point and very welcome.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. Daye, what's your feeling about this? Donald Trump, as I've just mentioned there, made a lot of changes to America's policies. But of course, America pulled out of the climate accord, the Paris Climate Accord as well, and Biden is bringing it back into that. How important is America, do you think, in the sort of geopolitical situation when dealing with climate change?
Oh, it's very important. Are they not the largest emitters of carbon in the whole of all the nations in the world?
It could be.
We think of China.
Yeah. I was going to say per head of population, that may well be true, I think.
Yeah, you think of China and India, but actually, no, it's America. And Trump set back the progress that we all thought was going to be made at that Paris Agreement. And it was devastating, not just for, as has just been stated, for America, but for the whole of the world.
So we've lost 4 years because of Donald Trump's actions, 4 years out of the countdown towards some kind of climate crisis.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And he is culpable. He needs to end up in jail for what he's done, not just to the American people, but to the whole of the rest of the world.
Well, we remain to be seen whether the rest of the world agrees with you, Daye, but let's hope they do. Anyway, we're going to stay with climate for our next story, and climate change concern appears to be unaffected by the pandemic. COVID-19 has not made people any less concerned about climate change, despite the pandemic disrupting and dominating many aspects of their lives, a study suggests. Over a period of 14 months, including the first 3 months of the COVID-19 lockdown, neither concern about climate change nor belief in the severity of the problem declined in the UK, the researchers found. Researchers compared responses to the pandemic with the financial crisis of 2008 to better understand how worries and priorities can change in a crisis. In contrast to the economic collapse of 2008, which led to reduced concern about environmental issues, the pandemic has not decreased people's belief in the severity of climate change. The findings shed light on how the concept called the finite pool of worry applies to climate change. The theory proposes that there are only so many things a person can care about, and when a major crisis happens, some concerns are replaced by others. However, in this case, climate change was not replaced by other issues, the researchers say. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh surveyed 1,858 people in the United Kingdom in April 2019 and asked the same questions again in June 2020. The survey included 5 questions to gauge people's beliefs about the reality of climate change and 4 about how severe they think it is. The results show only small shifts in public opinion. Participants' answers to 4 of the 5 questions about the reality of human-caused climate change showed slightly increased concern since the onset of the pandemic. Only 1 of the 4 questions about the seriousness of climate change showed a slight reduction, while the other responses showed no marked change in their views. The results suggest that climate change may now be a permanent part of people's concerns, the researchers say. Dr. Derek Evanson of the University of Edinburgh School of Social and Political Science said, following the financial crisis, it seemed that climate change was one thing that gave, and most people saw it as less of a problem. We are not seeing that same crowding out of climate change as an issue of concern now. This means heightened societal attention to climate change is here to stay. The study is published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. Okay, let's let you have a crack at this one, Audrey. This is a slightly, well, to me at least, a slightly surprising result. You would have expected perhaps people to become more concerned about future pandemics or something else, but it seems that people are still very concerned about the climate.
Yeah, and I have to say, I am quite surprised, although I'm delighted to hear that, because I sometimes we get a bit fatigued by an issue, and if the pandemic had caused us to have a little bit of climate change fatigue, I would have understood that. I think genuinely people do understand the link between climate change and pandemics, just taking that as an example. And I think perhaps the reality of living that has really started to make people focus their thoughts and their sort of understanding of what that link is. And in my view, going forward, we are going to have really big priorities to tackle in Scotland around Brexit and public health recovery. But for me, I would put climate change right up there with those priorities. They're all so vastly interlinked, and I think that ideally it would be, for me, the right approach would be to try and make sure that our public health recovery, our economic recovery, but also our climate change agenda sort of run almost in parallel with each other.
That's an interesting observation. Daye, following on from Audrey's comments, it dawned on me while she was speaking there that the pandemic has made people acutely aware of the fact that they are capable of changing their behaviour in a huge way. Many of us had commented on how much quieter the world seemed without jets going overhead. And there was something like an 80% reduction in air pollution caused by the lack of air travel. Do you think that this has given people a glimpse of what might be possible if they change their ways?
Absolutely. It's there for all to see. And climate changers can no longer deny that human behavior is affecting the climate. As farmers, some of them have been slow to accept climate change, but more recently, they've all started to accept it because of the disease spread. And we've always been told that climate change is going to become a threat for faster spread of diseases. And we've seen it happen with new diseases coming across from Europe into the south of England, and then spreading further north. And we have a sort of warning thing that goes out to us to tell us when there's going to be a threat from, let's say, fluke or nematodirus.
Yeah.
And all down the west of the UK, it's so much wetter here that we're all under a more serious threat of liver fluke. Whereas, and now even in the east and the northeast, liver fluke is a huge problem throughout flocks and herds of cattle.
That's an interesting comment, David, because you see the link between the changing weather patterns and the wetter climate and the prevalence of these diseases. Is it something that you say it concerns farmers? Has it been measured in any appreciable way? Can we quantify it?
Oh, yes, very much so. I mean, to get down to its basic, there's something like a 60, in some years, it can be a 90% wastage of livers in an abattoir, which is a huge cost to the whole industry. I mean, you're talking millions of pounds. And that's very dependent on the year and how wet it's been or when it has occurred, because the life cycle of the liver fluke is very complicated. And to add to the problems, because it's so complicated, farmers haven't really understood the life cycle, so they've been banging in the liver fluke. What do you call them? The medicines. And abusing it, a bit like antibiotics that can be abused. So it's a big problem.
Okay, well, thank you, Daye. It's an interesting take on both the pandemic and climate change and other diseases. We're going to go to a completely different subject now, and legislation for the licensing scheme on short-term lets has been withdrawn from the Scottish Parliament. Legislation for a short-term lets licensing scheme has been withdrawn from the Scottish Parliament to allow for draft guidance to be developed. A stakeholder working group has been established to help develop guidance and meets today for the first time. The guidance will help to provide provide reassurance on the operation of the scheme to operators and hosts in the sector. Subject to the outcome of the election, the Scottish Government intends to relay the legislation before Parliament in June, accompanied by the draft guidance, to ensure that the timetable for introducing licensing remains the same. The Government will continue legislation allowing councils to establish short-term let control areas. This legislation will empower local authorities to implement short-term let control areas if they wish to do so, to address pressures created by the whole property short-term lets. Ensuring that homes are used to the best effect in their areas. Now, Audrey, this is a subject which the Scottish Government has taken head on, and we tend not to mention it very much, but Airbnb seems to be the area targeted by this legislation. Why is the legislation necessary? What is the problem that it's designed to address? Do you know?
Well, having never stayed in a B&B, I confess that up front, but I would imagine that the legislation is really just to try and bring the regulation around accommodation, housing, short-term, the short-term part of that sector, to bring that in line with other legislative provision that has been made in other areas of housing, whether it's private housing, whether it's local authority and so on. So I welcome this being brought forward. I think it's the right thing to do, given where we are in Scotland with this particular type of short-term let. So I think this is the right way to go forward.
Okay, thank you, Audrey. Daye, it's been said that, if somebody lives in a rural community and they take a short-term let, then they're going to be kicked out in the summer or be faced with paying much higher rentals, which would normally be charged to holiday makers. Is this a problem for rural communities in Scotland, and does this legislation do much to help that?
Well, I don't know whether, because I'm not, I haven't read up on the legislation, but it's certainly as much of a problem in rural areas as it is in urban areas. So you've only got to look at Edinburgh to see how it is affecting the shortage of accommodation in Edinburgh, where you've got all these flats that are being let out for Airbnb on very short-term lets,
Yeah.
to the expense of people who are actually needing to live in the city, and they can't find accommodation because they're all Airbnbs. So there has to be a balance somewhere. And perhaps in the legislation this is allowed, I don't know. Presumably the local authority is more power to control either areas in the city or the amounts of Airbnbs that they're allowed, the percentage within the total.
It must be very tempting for people who have property in rural areas to try and make some money out of them in the summer months by letting them out at higher rates. Would you say, Daye, that the real solution to this problem is actually just to provide more cheap housing for people who work in these local communities?
Absolutely. There is the answer. And we really need to get our act together to provide more affordable, and that word even has been abused, because if you come to Killearn and you look at the affordable houses in Killearn, they might be affordable a lot of people in Killearn, but they certainly wouldn't be affordable for lots of other people, because they're based in that area in Killearn. It's based on the average house price in Killearn, which you can imagine is pretty high.
Yeah.
So even the affordable house is not affordable to a lot of people. So we just need to give more space for more variable housing units.
Yeah, for people who permanently want to move to the country. Anyway, talking of the countryside brings us to our final story, this time a coastal part of the countryside. And Ardrossan Harbour is to be renovated. Troon Harbour will be used as an alternative berth for the Arran ferry service during the planned upgrade of Ardrossan Harbour. The recommendation, which will see services resume from Ardrossan once works are completed, was confirmed at a meeting of the project's ministerial task force. The task force's decision, which followed a review of all potential options, was guided by the community request to maximise the reliability of the alternative service for ferry users. Further work will also be undertaken to look at potential measures to support the community in Ardrossan during the construction works. The use of Troon Harbour for the duration of the works was backed by 79% of respondents to a survey carried out this month. Okay, let me come first of all to you on this one, Daye, as a rural leader. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Ardrossan and Arran. I am, but Ardrossan Harbour has been badly in need of renovation for some time. So this surely is another piece of great news.
It certainly is. And our harbours, there's so much more that we need to do in Scotland to make us, I was going to say independent, but that's trite, but to make us resilient in terms of travel and trade and so much more. But it's wonderful that we've got Troon there just ready and waiting to be used, as well as Ardrossan. And hopefully they might be able to continue to use it. And indeed other harbours. What about Girvan? Is Girvan used for anything?
Good question, Daye. I'm not sure about that. Maybe it isn't. It may not be big enough, I think, for the ferries.
Let's make it capable.
Well, Troon certainly is deep enough for the ferries that run to Arran, I know that. But I also know that Ardrossan, traditionally, as a South Ayrshire town, has lacked investment in jobs for many years.
Yeah.
Anyway, let me ask you, Audrey, since you're from Aberdeenshire, and there are plenty of coastal towns up in your neck of the woods. This particular upgrade to Ardrossan Harbour is actually probably decades overdue. Arran is known as the sort of secret jewel of the Scottish holiday destinations and used a lot by Scottish tourists, but surely upgrading the harbour in Ardrossan would help to attract people from further afield.
Very much so, and I think it's probably coming at a really. It's good that the project is going ahead, particularly while we're still in the pandemic. I think the impact of that will be even greater than it perhaps would normally be. But yeah, absolutely. I think harbours bring huge opportunities, and as a councillor of a ward where a new harbour is actually in the process of being built, I'm aware that not just the sort of local benefit from the more sort of commercial benefit that a harbour can bring around things like decommissioning, oil and gas industry, energy transition, but also the that really key part of our economy, which is tourism, broadening that out to in a European and perhaps a global context. So I think this is a really, really exciting piece of good news for the day.
Well, it's always nice to end on a good news story. And of course, we're very near the end of the programme. But just before we leave you tonight, let me remind you that we're in the middle of a major crowdfunder here at Broadcasting Scotland. So if you would like to help us to be there throughout the rest of 2021 to report on all of the big events which are coming up, including the general election and potentially another independence referendum, you can do that by following the instructions on your screen now. Go to our website and become a supporter of Broadcasting Scotland, or you can make an individual donation, or indeed you can volunteer if you don't want to make a donation. Anyway, that is about all we have time for this evening. Just remains for me to thank both my guests, Daye Tucker. Thanks again, Dave, for being here again. And also to thank Audrey Nicol in Aberdeen for being a guest for the first time. Thanks again, Audrey. So from the three of us, from all of us here at the studio at Scotland at 7, a very good night to you.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.